Welcome on the ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Palais. Welcome to December, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Ellen Morrissey, one of our staff writers and a regular on the show who helps us cover all things presidential and federal, and to help us make sense of the vacancy procedures that'll play out early next year following several of incoming President Donald Trump's cabinet appointments. A little bit of a game of musical chairs, and whenever you have new appointments, this creates downstream impacts and implications on existing office holders. So let's talk through all that today, and Ellen is here to help us make sense of all of that. So Ellen, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Let's just talk through it. What current elected officials have been nominated? They're not necessarily confirmed yet. We'll get into that later, but have at least been sort of, verbally put out there by the incoming president to join the cabinet, which would require them, therefore, to leave their existing elected position. So walk us through what we know so far.
For sure. So up top, we've got two currently sitting governors who have been announced for cabinet level positions. We have Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota. She got announced as Trump's Homeland Security Secretary nominee. And then we've got Doug Burgum, who got announced for Secretary of the Interior. However, Doug Burgum did not seek re-election this cycle, and so he's currently serving his final term in office, which will end in December, just in time for him to go through the confirmation process starting in, January, February. No scheduling conflicts there for him. His confirmation would not create a vacancy, but Noem's would. Looking at the House, we've got a bit more of a complicated picture here. We have Elise Stefanik out of New York, who got nominated for UN ambassador. She is currently serving in office and has not yet announced her kind of resignation plans yet. And then we've got Michael Waltz out of Florida, who got announced for national security advisor. This is not a cabinet level position. This is just a position within Trump's executive office. So Trump can just directly appoint this individual. The Senate doesn't really play a role. So Michael Waltz can start the day Trump is inaugurated.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in real quick because there are thousands and thousands of positions that the president has to nominate. Some of them are Senate approved, some of them are not. So what you're getting at here is that Waltz is actually one of the positions that is not a Senate required confirmation.
Yeah. So, Waltz's plans for resignation kind of reflect that he's planning on resigning from the 119th Congress, which is the upcoming Congress that starts on January 3rd. He'll be resigning on January 20th, Inauguration Day. And then we've got two kind of weirder cases here. We've got current U.S. House Rep. Lori Chavez DeRemer out of Oregon. She has been nominated for Labor Secretary. However, she did not win re-election this election cycle in 2024. So she, like Burgum, will have an open schedule when it comes to being able to go through the confirmation process for a labor secretary. And then we've got Matt Gaetz, who Trump announced him as his original pick for Attorney General nominee. That same day, Gaetz announced he was resigning from the current Congress and that he would not be sworn into the upcoming Congress. And then about a week later, Gaetz withdrew his nomination from consideration, but has still maintained that he will not try to be sworn into the 119th Congress. So that will create a vacancy that needs to be filled.
Let's for a second about the swearing-ins. I know there's still a couple more that you're going to get into, but there's a really interesting sort of little persnickety little detail about the way our government works here. So let's tell a little story first. In the states, the state legislatures swear in the winners of an election at very different intervals. So, for instance, there are some states that have already sworn in the state legislators who won in November, and they're already sitting there as the new legislators. There are other states that will not swear in the new members until the end of January. So you have a wide swath of dates in there. Now, the same thing happens with Congress and with the federal government. Donald Trump will not be sworn in until January 20th. The new Congress will be sworn in January 3rd. You'll actually have the 17-day window then where you have a new Congress with current President Joe Biden. And what we've seen in historical years is that the new Congress will begin holding confirmation hearings for the new cabinet even before the new president is sworn in. That's the sort of typical practice that's happened over the years. And understanding all the sort of moving parts with that is a really complicated part of the process, I guess. So what did I miss? Because this is a complicated setup, right?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. But I think you summed it up really well. Yeah, there's kind of this funky period where you've got the, lame duck president, but the brand new Congress working together. You'll see them kind of collaborate on things like certifying the electoral college vote. The vice president kind of oversees, is not empowered in any way, but does oversee that session of Congress, things like that. So they overlap. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So then now let's go back to other current elected officials. Now let's go to the Senate. So what's going on with the Senate?
Yeah, so we've got Trump has announced one cabinet nominee out of the Senate. He has announced his selection of Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. And then we've got not exactly a cabinet nominee or presidential appointment, but we do also have JD Vance, who is a sitting US Senator from Ohio, but who will be sworn in as Vice President on January 20th. So those both will be vacancies to watch in the 119th Congress as well.
Yeah. So a number of different moving parts. So let's talk a little bit then about the different replacement procedures, right? Because governor's house, Senate, how a vacancy is filled differs depending on the state and the type of office. What are the varying approaches that are taken and how are these open positions filled?
Yeah. So if we want to start maybe with the House and Senate, these vacancy procedures are both outlined in the US Constitution. So the House in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution just says the governor has to call for a special election to fill the vacancy. Then with the Senate, it gets a little bit complicated or a little funky. The Senate vacancy procedures are outlined in the 17th Amendment, which was ratified in 1913, which one of the big things this amendment did was change how senators were elected. Before this, senators were elected by state legislatures. This switched it to the popular election of US senators. So, a state, the people in a state voting for a US senator. But it also kind of established new vacancy procedures. So basically, they modeled the special election language on the vacancy procedures for the House in the Constitution. So a special election does need to be called eventually to fill that Senate seat. However, the amendment also allows state legislatures to empower governors to make temporary appointments until a special election is held. There are only 6 states that don't allow this, Kentucky, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin.
Yeah, so you can, imagine there's strategy behind these appointments. Even if Tom Tillis was considered to be a perhaps perfect person for a cabinet position, odds are Donald Trump would not have put him forth for that because it would have meant a Democratic governor could select Tillis's replacement. This is just, the insider baseball works. It's not terribly surprising, but all elected officials, and they base their decisions based on the rules around them. And the rules governing how these vacancies filled certainly governs the decisions that presidents make and who they're choosing for open positions. For instance, we can be certain that President Donald Trump would not pick 10 U.S. House members and suddenly give up the majority in the chamber. So, what else do we know about the state of temporary appointments in the Senate?
Something that's kind of interesting, actually kind of not to, correct you too much, but looking at that North Carolina example you mentioned, actually, there are, like, some kind of unique rules, since state legislatures set the rules for, like, the manner in which governors can make these appointments, there are some rules attached in some states. So there are actually 9 states where a, governor is required to appoint someone of the same party as the vacating senator. North Carolina is one of them. We also have Arizona, Hawaii, Kentucky, Maryland, Montana, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming.
Thank you for pointing that out. And you're right. In some of those states, I think they passed some of those bills in recent years, actually, probably for very specific and legitimate reasons, I guess.
Ab
Uh,
Exactly, yeah.
so, what about the history behind all of this? What's happened over the years?
Something that I thought was pretty interesting, kind of like digging into the past numbers and kind of trying to figure out like how much power I guess a governor has in making these appointments, but then also, the kind of strategy behind them as well. The last time a governor appointed someone of a different party for a seat in the US Senate was back in 2013. And looking at the 30 Senate vacancies filled by a governor in the 20th or 21st century, only 3 of them have been filled by someone of a different party. So, which I think can be written up to elements like, these laws that we mentioned. it can be written up to the strategy in picking nominees, but I think there's also definitely political pressure for governors to select, a successor of the same party. But, I will say these appointments can last, especially since in many states these appointments last until the next general election. They can last as long as 2 years. So it is a temporary appointment, but it is a rather long one.
That's the Senate for us. So let's talk a little more about then the House. The House is expected to have, as of this recording, it's looking like it'll be 220 to 214, give or take. What impact will these U.S. House vacancies potentially have in the chamber? What is being written about it? What are we kind of expecting to see?
Our kind of baseline is that we've got a pretty narrow majority here. As you mentioned, it's 220 Republicans won their elections in 2024, and then 214 races have been called for Democrat. There's one uncalled race in California's 13th congressional district where the Democrat currently leads by a couple hundred votes. So if that bears out and the Democrat ends up winning, it'll be 220 to 215. However, Republicans are down one with Gates's resignation, temporarily at least. So they'll be starting with only 219 members in their majority. So, a 4 or 5 seat majority. But then January 20th comes around. Waltz will resign from the U.S. House, bringing it down to a either 3 or 4 seat majority. And then Stefanik's resignation, which has not yet, we don't yet have a plan for that. But once she does, it'll bring it down to either a 2 or 3 seat majority. Um, Looking back at kind of some previous UN ambassador confirmations, Biden's UN ambassador was confirmed in February, and during Trump's first term, his UN ambassador was confirmed in January. So I think it's relatively safe to assume that we'll see Stefanik depart the House in the first month or two of the 119th Congress, which, leaves Republicans with about a month, maybe 2 months of, a 2 or 3 seat majority in the House, which is pretty narrow. As far as when these vacancies will start getting filled, we have dates for both Gates's and Waltz's seats, Florida's 1st congressional district and Florida's 6th congressional district, respectively. Their special elections will take place on the same schedule. Their primaries will both be on January 28th, and the generals will be on April 1st. And then after the general is held and the race is called, that's when the new U.S. House rep can be sworn into Congress. Stefanik's special election has not been scheduled because she has not yet announced her resignation, and that would be in New York's 21st congressional district. New York Governor Kathy Hochul will be required by law to set a date for the special election within 10 days of Stefanik announcing her resignation, and then that special election has to take place between 70 or 80 days. If we're kind of looking at what we think the results of these special elections will be heading into all of these races in 2024, these districts were all rated solid Republican. Based on what I've read, if any of these races are going to be kind of competitive, it's sounding like Stefanik's is expected to be the most competitive. It's the district that was most recently held by a Democrat of the three. Back in 2012, former U.S. Rep. Bill Owens preceded Stefanik. He last won election in 2012. But I will say this was, a Trump plus 16 district in 2020, so it's still pretty red.
One thing that's kind of interesting is different branches of government have different replacement procedures. So, for instance, in SCOTUS, you can stay in your seat until the new person is confirmed, and they can basically literally take office the next day. House, Senate, you can't do that. It's not like one of these U.S. House members can say, well, I'm just going to stay in my seat and not start serving in the federal administration until my replacement comes in. It has to happen sort of sequentially. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit then about gubernatorial positions. And so when a governor is tapped for a federal county position, we've got two potential examples. The procedures can vary quite a bit. So what is the status with the states where we're going to see an existing sitting governor join the federal administration?
As I kind of mentioned earlier, Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota, he's already leaving office in mid-December, I believe, is when his term ends, and then confirmation hearings won't start till January. So gubernatorial vacancy rules won't come into play there. The winner of the 2024 North Dakota gubernatorial election will just take office, regularly scheduled procedure there. As far as South Dakota goes, it's pretty simple. South Dakota is one of the 45 states with a lieutenant governor. And in those states, the lieutenant governor just takes office once the sitting governor resigns. And that is the case in South Dakota as well. So if Noem is confirmed, she'll resign. And her lieutenant governor, Larry Roden, will assume office. And Roden will also succeed to the office with the kind of full powers and duties of the governor. So will be able to kind of assume office as a regular South Dakota governor would.
Right. So Ronan will take over, and then he'll just pick a new lieutenant governor, or will there be a special election for that lieutenant governor?
This is kind of one of those things that will vary state by state, but in South Dakota specifically, when the office of the lieutenant governor becomes vacant, the governor then nominates a replacement. However, in South Dakota, that replacement will then need to be approved by both chambers of South Dakota's state legislature. But once the candidate gets that approval, then that candidate can assume office as lieutenant governor.
Got it. And you kind of mentioned this earlier, and this might have some of our listeners scratching their heads. There are states without lieutenant governors. So 45 states have lieutenant governors, but 5 states do not. So what would they do if what's the replacement procedure like in a state without a lieutenant governor? Who takes over?
In those other 5 states, there are kind of other positions in government that are designated as the first in line successors to the governorship. In Maine and New Hampshire, the president of the state senate takes office. And then similarly, also in West Virginia and Tennessee, the president of the Senate will also take office as governor since they serve as lieutenant governor ex officio. And then there are 3 states, Arizona, Oregon, and Wyoming, where the Secretary of State will take office. And something else that's kind of interesting, I guess, to mention with these vacancy procedures is there is a line of succession, but there can be kind of some caveats to that line of succession. Depending on the state, this may include the officer who succeeds to the governorship may not have the same full powers as an elected governor. There are some caveats related to whether the individual who replaces the elected governor must belong to the same party as the governor. And there are, also some caveats related to if, a governor gets nominated to serve in a presidential cabinet, since they are resigning voluntarily, whether they have any influence or are able to name their own replacement, things like that. Those kind of little caveats can exist depending on the state.
Got it. Very interesting stuff. Lots of downstream implications of decisions in politics every day. Ellen, great having you back on the show again. And we will talk to you certainly in the future about all that is transpiring with the new administration and when they take over and how all that works. So thanks for coming on. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
For our listeners, you can learn more about our elections coverage and the new administration at our link in the show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for listening.